Great. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mike Talbot. I'm the Notre Dame International's Director for Initiatives in Mexico. This is one in a series of talks and conversations that we've been having over the past 7 months about Notre Dame's research and collaboration with partners in Mexico. We've been very happy this semester in particular to highlight the work of some of the great Notre Dame PhD students and researchers. The series is sponsored by Notre Dame's Mexico Global Center here in Mexico City, and it's an opportunity to really deepen our partnerships, both in Mexico and the United States, around common interests and shared goals. Before we begin, just a quick reminder that we've probably all heard 1,000 times now. Please keep your microphones on mute. This will help prevent any interruptions during Dominique's presentation. Second, Dominique welcomes your questions. There's time at the end of her presentation to address and respond to those. If you want to raise your hand or indicate in the chat, I'll be happy to call on you. Don't be shy. I don't always see the hand raise feature, so speak up if you have a question to ask at the end. And likewise, if you're in a situation where you're not able to ask a question directly, just submit it via text and via the chat function, and I'll gladly ask it on your behalf. So today we're very pleased to have Dominique Vargas with us. Dominique is a University Presidential Fellow, a PhD Fellow with the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, and a Graduate Student Fellow with the Institute for Latino Studies. She specializes in 20th and 21st century American literature with a focus on race, gender, linguistics, and literary theory. Dominique's dissertation theorizes non-representational and non-verbal discourses and performance in contemporary writing by women. The project argues that these discourses are embodied, effective responses to the contemporary moment in which neoliberal forms restructure the continent and its inhabitants through political and economic policies. Today, she'll be discussing some of the work of Mexican author Cristina Rivera Garza. I have to admit that I was not very familiar with Garza's work before this, but I had the opportunity to read a few of her books in the past weeks. And well, thank you to Dominique for introducing me to her. It's been so great to discover a new author and has made me really excited for today's talk. So without any more delay, please join me in welcoming Dominique Vargas.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you so much for facilitating this. And I want to say thank you to the Mexico Global Initiative for hosting. And I'm really excited to share some of the things that I've been working on. As you said, my research focuses on the body. So I'll be talking a lot about the body, and I'll be talking about free trade and about political and economic policy as they come to bear on the body. And a quick sort of description for those of us who are not literary scholars. I see a lot of my English department people here. Thank you for coming. But just a quick caveat that literary studies, my approach to literary studies is that I do a lot of close reading, and then I try and understand texts through context. So I think about what the writer is doing in the particular moment, and I think about the historical and political realities that the writer is producing this work in. So there will be some interesting close readings, some comment on translation, some things like that throughout. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the presentation. And I'm signed out, which is really exciting. So I'm going to stop sharing. For some reason, I got signed out, and I'm going to sign in real quick. And then I will share once more so you can see the presentation. Okay. So can everyone see? We good? All right, so as Mike said, today I'll be talking about Cristina Rivera Garza's work. I will first start with a poem of hers, which is called Tercer Mundo. And through it, then following that, I'll move on to a discussion of transnationalism and poetics. And then I'll discuss the way that Rivera Garza's work engages with landscapes, bodies, and sort of being in the world to grapple with the contemporary. So just a little background, Cristina Rivera Garza was born in Mexico in 1964, and she's lived in the United States since 1989. She studied urban sociology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and received her PhD in Latin American history from the University of Houston. Her doctoral thesis was on the subjection of the human body to state power in asylums in 20th century Mexico. She's the author of several novels, of nonfiction, of essays, and collections of short stories and poetry. But most of her work there's an interesting linguistic dynamic with her work. She is writing in the United States and conceives of a lot of these things in English, but then turns and writes them in Spanish, and then they are translated again into English. So there's a very exciting translation story happening here. She's won numerous awards. She's the only author who's actually won the Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz Prize twice, first in 2001 and then again in 2009. And this year she was awarded one of the prestigious MacArthur Fellowships. So I'm going to play a short video so we can hear just a little bit about her.
If I had been comfortable with the world in which I was living, I would have never written a word. Writing came as a result of having to explain to myself the enigma that the world was for me. My name is Cristina Rivera Garza, and I am a writer. I've written most. If I had been comfortable with the world in which I was living, I would have never written.
But you get the idea. I could listen to her all day because she's just so lovely. In her fiction, Rivera Garza interrogates culturally constructed notions of language, of memory, of gender, all of these things from a transnational perspective. Her novels, first No One Will See Me Cry, and then The Iliac Crest, and then now The Taiga Syndrome, which I will talk about towards the end of my presentation. They all think about characters who kind of stumble on images, texts, fragments, or people who disturb the clarity of the historical record. So Rivera Garza's concern with the archive, with history, with gender, with mental health, all of these things are, I think, increasingly important in the contemporary, when many of these concerns continue to be overlooked, demonized, marginalized. And this is also a symptom, I think, of the broader context of life structured through neoliberal forms. So I'll start with her poem, Tercer Mundo. So this is a long poem, and it addresses many of these themes through the lens of globalization. So in this poem, Rivera Garza asks what it would be like to imagine the third world from two perspectives. From the world systems theory that invented it. So within that world systems theory that invented it and codified its existence in opposition to the first world, and then also outside of that system. And I think what's important here is that this can't really be done by thinking about the world before modernity or thinking about what might come after colonization or after these systems are over. Instead, this is a kind of leap of faith and a kind of radical intimacy. So the poem opens with these strange geographical markers that kind of push beyond the putative borders of nation and toward an understanding of landscape more generally, and then landscape as experience. So the opening of the poem says, "It was at the far edge of the far edge, about to exist and about not to exist, like faith. The third world was a roofless house, the terzo." So outside of any kind of geopolitical borders, the orilla, the far edge, becomes a kind of liminal state that contains both the possibility of resistance and the ongoing subordination that's happening there. So to further render the experience of living outside of the first world's imagination of underdevelopment of the third space or of the people in the third space, Rivera Garza doesn't simply use tercer. She doesn't rely just on the Spanish, but instead she also thinks about, she turns to Italian. So she uses terzo. So this linguistic deviation or disruption kind of further highlights the distance between the speaker and the discourse of Euromodernity. So we have several lenses through which we're viewing this third space or this third world. The terzo also provides a kind of interesting allusion to Dante. We have the Dantean underworld of poverty, of crime, of pollution. We'll see some of these on the next slide here. And then the denizens of the terzo, the ones that she calls the dead, the pariahs, the suicidal, the good for nothings. They're both victims of exploitation as well as voices of resistance. And she writes, although forever mute, they speak with the fervor of the converted. So again, we have that religious imagery. And throughout the poem, Rivera Garza's simultaneous description of these denizens as both good for nothing, but also highly useful, kind of ventriloquizes the discourse of both the US and of Mexico, which kind of condemns migration while also and simultaneously opening borders for trade, and really depending on undervalued and underpaid and dangerous migrant labor. So these marginalized beings are characterized by constant movement throughout the poem. Most strikingly, though, they seem to move toward the terzo as a topological center. So this attempt to go towards the terzo is historical fact, right? It's referencing migration. But there's also this poetic refrain of let's go to the terzo. And it indicates that the terzo is a kind of fantasy, maybe a teleological fantasy, that indicates both an eternal becoming and a utopia. So this no place, or an illusory no place. In Grieving, Dispatches from a Wounded Country, which is one of the texts that I'll be talking about today. Flash this up here for you. In Grieving, Rivera Garza reflects on this movement through the image of the artist Alejandro Santiago's 2,501 Migrants. So you see an image of that here on your screen. She writes, these clay figures, 2,500 of them, the same number of families that, as far as Santiago remembers, lived in his hometown. 2,500 plus one. The next one, there's always one more. She writes that this project questions how actual flesh and blood migrants are produced through the needs of North American capital, which creates an economic diaspora in Oaxaca, but also in so many other states, that leaves what she calls a rosary of ghost towns in its wake. So Santiago makes these figures, and they're almost life-size. They're about 5 feet tall, and makes these figures out of clay. And that clay comes from Zacatecas. And that region is also characterized by this emptying and this movement of people out and into the United States or out into other metropoles where they can work. And that clay becomes, as it stands in the heat and in the sun, becomes a kind of mud and then a dust and then almost nothing. It kind of wears away. And then as it dries out, these figures get slashes or marks in the faces and in the torsos, showing that the clay, a kind of malleable framework, opens itself up and can't be closed again. And Rivera Garza calls these flowering wounds and identity markers and maps. So we see that the body becomes enmeshed with the landscape in this art installation, and movement across militarized borders shows that the body, it's changed by that movement, and then it changes the towns and cities that they move through. And then it also changes those borders again as it then becomes reified. So Rivera Garza reminds us that the 2,501 Migrants is essentially a meditation on absence. 2,501 Migrants is a project about the absent body. And when Santiago places those figures in this town in Oaxaca, he's doing something that's really powerful with their presence or their complete absence, right? It ceases to be a ghost town, though it still is a ghost town, and becomes a town of pure invention. That's what Rivera Garza calls it. And she says, if that isn't the power of art, then what is? If that isn't a form of resistance, then what is? So Santiago positions these migrants northward. They're looking northward. There's been some discussion recently if they should be turned southward in their presentation, but mostly northward. And in the language of Tercer Mundo, we can say that they are on the far edge, looking toward employment, toward economic security, to new labor possibilities in this multinational consolidation of countries. But the migrants are, in Rivera Garza's words, always absent. So right now they are, she says, right now they are all crossing an eternal gerund. I stand looking at the clay bodies and suddenly I feel like I am one of them. And that is to say, when you, which is another way of saying I, see us. So it's a little bit confusing, a little bit poetic here in this essay, but what she's saying here is that she's really turning individual subjectivity on its head. And to exist in this space is to exist in communion with absence and presence. So this is an ongoing movement. So we see landscape here where one loses one's history, where gender, familial, and social divisions break down, and then they're reconfigured. Tercer Mundo describes this as a kind of aura of estrangement from known terms and known identities and known landscapes. So this longer section here says, on the way to the Terzo, they tore off the straitjackets of old names and emerged from their pasts with fine, fine hides of bones with no history. They were the she-devil, the giga-dog, the frog, little Lulu, red rooster Ed, the queen beast. The strands of their bodies slid without difficulty through the needle's tiny eye, which was the gateway to eternity. And when they headed out, dizzy for the city, they took the Terzo with them, hanging from their shoulders, proud of their shapelessness. So the third world is less a place left behind and more of a condition that these figures carry with them into perpetual exile. As others, the denizens of the Terzo lack subjectivity assumed in citizenship and belonging and individuality, and they're sort of marginalized and rendered through objecthood. But in the final section of this poem, or the final chunk of this poem, Rivera Garza turns this objectification on its head, suggesting a transition from object to subject status. And she writes, I were an other, but I was more. So this is this movement from object to subject seems to indicate that it's not done in isolation. We have the first person pronoun combined with eras, which is the second person of the singular, suggesting that the speaker is no longer singular or isolated, but more than herself, pero era más. The speaker exceeds this singularity and joins in community, which is itself resists form. So it too exists on the edge. So again, with the language of the Terzo, in an ongoing becoming. So it's here that we see the Terzo anew from both outside and within the world system theory. And the poem then turns to define the Terzo and these peripheral denizens as existing sort of beyond failed capitalist geographies. As a world that's forever on the outskirts of form, of nation, of identity, or language, or power, the Terzo occupies the same realm as religion. So something that, or faith, not necessarily like institutional religion, but faith. Something that in order to be imagined must be accepted, like faith. And that's something kind of revolutionary, or at least resisting the world that's based on empirical evidence. So the movement from a there, where the third world people are synonymous with underdevelopment and lack, to a here and now, where the first person singular, and then in the final stanzas of the poem, the first person plural, come into play. So how to say the Terzo once again, without putting out this match of words, this inaugural illumination that wakeful unveils the dactyl veridically. We were a vertiginous peeking out from behind the veins, an aerial industriousness of legs and fingernails and cartilage. We were saliva. So in these very last lines of the poem, the speaker, and I think the poet too, is imagining a form of embodiment in which one can not only uses language, but becomes the literal tissue and the literal body from which language is emanating. So instead of being the abject body, those who dwell in the terso kind of re-inhabit visceral bodies that can speak back to their objectification. So the big question here is why is this liminal position such an apt description of the contemporary world? I think that liminality of subject position, you can always talk about it in border discourse or anything, or you can find a corollary there. But it's also, I think, felt in the neoliberal forms that produce free trade agreements like NAFTA, right, which structures the hemisphere through capital. Michael Davidson, who's a professor and literary scholar at UCSD, and I'm indebted to him for some of the readings of Tercer Mundo, but he suggests that by focusing on texts forged around a hemispheric trading bloc, rather than a particular school or a shared aesthetic or even a particular national literature, we might be able to discover critical affinities that are grounded in political and material realities of globalization. So it's here that subjects are produced and economic displacement is really lived in those forms. I'm focusing here on NAFTA because of Rivera Garza's particular place as a Mexican writer in the US. And when it was passed in 1994, NAFTA was seen as an agreement between equal trading partners that promised the removal of tariffs and restrictions on both material and intellectual property amongst the three countries. But Maria Josefina Saldana Portillo observes that NAFTA may have opened up borders among the three nations, changing the formal legal controls of entry and exit of goods and capital, but notably that did not extend to people. So the promise of more jobs, of greater mobility, of increased environmental oversight, of faster growth and the leveling of economic disparities has really proven to be a kind of phantasm, especially for those who are at the lower end of the economic scale. So NAFTA coincides with the implementation of Operation Gatekeeper in the US. So we have this militarization of the southern border and the criminalization of movement, just as NAFTA is incentivizing and creating the conditions through agribusiness and through transnational companies, creating the conditions that led to the emptying of these rural communities. And this is particularly harmful for indigenous communities. And so then we have the loss of all these jobs to the developing world, and it's produced a growing trade deficit with Mexico, but also the anticipated increase in jobs for Mexican laborers has resulted in this permanent maquiladora underclass and an increase in border crossing and surveillance since the Act's passage. Many critics agree that NAFTA is less an act that promotes free trade and more an investment agreement that shores up the wealthiest sectors of the economy for each of the signatory countries. So how do these economic and political policies, like the removal of tariffs and subsidies to achieve more porous borders, actually impact literary production? More than anything, I think that literary texts after NAFTA are really involved in a reckoning of this illusory mobility, the reconsolidation of wealth, the containment of resistance within that totalizing surveillance regime, and of course, violence against the body. So in Grieving, Dispatches from a Wounded Country, Rivera Garza further links these neoliberal forms found in NAFTA to the spectacle of violence through the war on drugs. So this collection of essays, I should say, is published in a nationally syndicated newspaper. It was a column and then collected into this group of essays. But she writes that when Felipe Calderon declared his war on drugs in 2006, he lifted the veil of the gruesome, inescapable violence that had been integral to the lives of many in the poorer parts of the country. And she says, while we could face horror created by a state that had fully submitted to the economic interests of globalization and colonialism when that veil was lifted. And then the neoliberal Mexican state turns its back on its obligations and responsibilities, surrendering before what she calls the unrelenting lethal logic of maximum profit, beginning with the Salinas reforms and then continuing into the 21st century when she says the Mexican state, convinced of the supremacy of profit above life, withdrew protection and care for the bodies of its peoples. So I think it's really important that Rivera Garza identifies this state, the neoliberal Mexican state. She identifies it as a verb. She calls it the visceralist state. And she says the state here is a verb. And that state, like capital, is a relationship, which indicates that the state is always already sort of in relationship with the bodies of its peoples, of its constituents. And in this case, it transforms those bodies from vulnerable, which she says is a regular mode of human condition, to helpless, which is an artificial state that she says is caused by the spectacle and potential for violence. She also cites Oswaldo Zavala's argument that cartels were and are so intrinsically enmeshed in the state machinery that they have become a part of it. So that drug lords are businessmen who are prepared to go as far as necessary, which frequently means the space where the human condition ends, in order to ensure and above all increase their profits. So this reduces the body to its most basic form as a producer of capital through both the maquilas and the other transnational companies, and through the unilateral and spectacular violence of the narco state against the bodies of the population. So violence and capitalism go hand in hand in this world structured by free trade. And it's still almost impossible to imagine the world outside of these systems. But I think what Cristina Rivera Garza does is she unpacks these things in her poetry and in her fiction. So the surrealist narratives in Tercer Mundo also are present in the Taiga syndrome. So here's a lovely picture of the Taiga here from National Geographic. We have this third world as a self-generated out of place, as it's very grounded in a contemporary moment, but it's still outside of it. And she's asking us to imagine it both that way, both from within and outside of that moment. And in the Taiga syndrome, she accomplishes this by transporting this liminal third space to a different edge, right? And she calls it the world's end. The Taiga syndrome, which I have here to show you, is here's the English version, and here's the original version in Spanish. It's her most recently translated novel, and it follows a female detective who's hired by a man to search for his wife who has run away with another man. I think it's really important that the detective is a woman who is then going to search for another woman. The narrative is full of references to the gendered aspects of fairy tales, but it also hints at the danger that women face in neoliberal border spaces. In Grieving, Rivera Garza writes that a movement through space is dangerous, right? So she says attending school, going to work, running, visiting friends, grocery shopping, all of these seemingly harmless daily activities become time bombs, massacres waiting to happen if they're carried out by a woman's body. And she's referring, of course, to the feminicidios, but also to the enactment of patriarchal power in these neoliberal spaces. So the detective's client refers to this danger as el mal, de la taiga. So this is a mysterious syndrome or a madness or an evil. And the client asks the detective in their first conversation, but you know about the taiga syndrome, right? It seems that the certain inhabitants of the taiga begin to suffer terrible anxiety attacks and make suicidal attempts to escape, which is impossible to do if you're surrounded by the same terrain for 5,000 kilometers. And if you don't catch them and wrestle them down, they might vanish forever in the immensity of the taiga. So that's the client when he first hires the detective to find his wife. So I couldn't remember if I had that on this slide, but I'll go back here so you can look at the taiga again. This space that the narrator simply calls the taiga refers both to the named place and the that's the boreal forests of the Arctic Circle, which kind of separates the subarctic and then the tundra, and also that condition of exposure to violence or the potential for violence. But once the narrator agrees to travel to the taiga, we are introduced into this very strange liminal space where we have a kind of a hazy gray out between the subarctic and the tundra. And it translates onto this gritty world of noir. And we have a dash of dark fairy tales thrown in there. I highly recommend this book. It's very weird. But the world of the novella at first seems bidimensional. So at first it seems like the taiga exists separately from the real world that the detective inhabits. But her experience in the taiga destabilizes this construction. So ultimately they bleed into each other as she experiences them. And the detective and her quest kind of dissolve into this sensory totality of the taiga. And it positions the reader in a landscape that's sort of beyond the physical reality of any kind of like human understanding of it. There's no way to describe it, but to be there is to be enmeshed in it. So when they're kind of unable to bridge the gap between perception, place, and movement. And then the narrator or the detective and the reader are both inundated in that liminal space. The narrator is mapped onto, the narrative is mapped on to the form of a detective novel. So we have this noir world, and the novella is a kind of metaphysical detective story, which repackages the traditional noir detective story in a way that complicates reality, interpretation, and the limits of knowledge. So the taiga also utilizes classic detective fiction tropes of the missing person, but also of the defeated detective. So the narrator says again and again, it's been so long since I've worked, it's been a while since I worked, but what I really wanted to say, this is in the text, what I really wanted to say is, don't you know of my many failures? So we have this defeated detective searching for this missing person. And it's important to note that the taiga is also intrinsically linked to this neoliberal present. So despite the ethereal fairy tale quality of the taiga, the detective notes the influence and the presence of exportation and exploitation. She questions a lumber administrator who believed that the couple that she's searching for were spies. From the central government or some foreign competitor. It was all the same. Agents from large corporations trying to come and reestablish order, or worse, create a new order. In the village where they're searching for the client, or where she's searching for the client's wife, the inhabitants of this village say that they had invited this couple to participate in a celebration. And the detective thinks maybe it was a ritual or a way of fighting the scarcity of food, while also keeping community ties alive when people were facing the constant economic pounding involved in the production and exportation of lumber. And when they enter the forest, the detective understands that her experience actually differs from those who are there for the lumber industry. She says, when I looked behind us, the world seemed incomprehensible and eternal. Time. It was difficult to imagine what can't be described. The forest, for others, is less uniform and less forest than it felt to me, judging by the paths we were crossing. The development of the timber industry had brought lumberjacks and businessmen alike. The needs of the lumberjacks had, in turn, brought cooks and merchants, usury, and sex. So as the narrator gathers evidence about the disappearance of her client's wife, she's also gathering evidence about subjectivity, about who we are, who she is, place, globalization, borders, the nations in this world system, and narrative, things about the history and about present and how those come to bear on the body and on relationships. So this is as much an exploration of the global, of world systems, of gender, of capitalism, as it is of the local, of memory, of time, of intimacy, of relation between people. So within the novella, Rivera Garza is the detective, essentially. And the problem is this neoliberal world order. This aligns with the way that she thinks about writing more generally. In a very recent interview done in October, she was talking about what she does as a writer. And she says, just as detectives who work with cases, I see myself as working with enigmas. Reality is convoluted, troublesome, problematic, horrific, and above all, enigmatic. I am, in that sense, a detective of language indeed. Unlike real life detectives, however, I don't aspire to resolve the riddle, to find the culprit or uncover the story, but to share a secret. Preserving the enigma and sharing it as such, as an enigma, is central to what I do. So the enigma of the taiga, and of course of that third space, is described through the sensory totality of this environment, through which the characters are moving. In the original, just a note on the illustrations that are going to follow, in the original Spanish version of the novella, there are illustrations done by Carlos Maikes, and they accompany the text and give a kind of visual representation, and they're all almost like seeing through the snow or seeing through the trees. And there's also at the end of the novel, in both versions, a track list of songs and music to accompany the reading. So you really get in that sensory totality, in that space of sound and sight, and you're reading and you're really pulled in with the detective as she's pulled into that space. In the English translation, you still get the track list, but you don't get the images. So I think that this is mainly achieved through language. So you have a kind of estrangement from language or through language. So that's the images that will be on the following slide. The narrator, the detective in the story, like Rivera Garza, reflecting on her writing, is not interested in recounting stories or solving cases, but in telling things, she says, in telling things how they were or how they could be or could have been. It was about how they still vibrate right now in the imagination. So in the novel, or in the novella, the narrator agrees to go look for the woman in spite of her previous failures, or maybe because of them. And she thinks that she's drawn in because the woman has left breadcrumbs. She's left messages. She's left telegrams. And the narrator says she took the case really because she had an all-consuming weakness for these forms of writing that were no longer in use. So telegrams, radiograms, she says sonography, all of these things. And she says, as I placed my hands on the paper, I began to dream. The tips of my fingers skimmed the creases of the paper, the stale smell of age, something hidden. Who would set out on such a journey? So she's following these Hansel and Gretel like breadcrumbs of the telegram, and she's reading the woman's journals. And she's attempting to piece together a picture of who this woman is. But she's already sort of inundated with the taiga, with the landscape. And that historical record is not as trustworthy as we might expect it to be. So she says, I did carry a few images of her in my head. For example, the recurrent image of the forest, the word coniferous, the word boreal, the word footpath. All together, they constituted something like a mantra or the sentimental beads of a rosary. So she can't know the woman, and she speculates that the woman can't know herself apart from the taiga. And I don't think this is implausible. British archaeologist Christopher Tilley proposes that the body is a measure of all things, that the experience of movement through landscape continually inscribes itself on the body, from sweat to heart rate to movement of the joints, the tendons, the muscles, And language of movement contributes in a fundamental way to thought, to emotions, to mood, and to feelings. And we see that here in the woman's journals and in the detective's search for her. So I think while Tilly was talking about the way we experience and encounter monuments or monumental space, specifically with Neolithic monuments, he draws on phenomenological theories to think about the body as integral to understanding both social space and landscape. The detective reflects on this concept, wondering how we can both know and not know space. She says, I remember the boundaries on the map that I either saw or anticipated in the moment, long ago when cartography was just beginning, though it was already a matter of life or death, and not just for those who went to sea. Maps were called portolan charts. From some place in my mind, the words Carta Pisana emerged, the date 1290, the sophisticated outline of shores, the details of life at the bottom of an enormous sea. So these portolan charts were extraordinarily detailed and really surprisingly accurate maps of coastlines, but they had no topographical features or details of the land. So we have really accurate mapping of ships, where ships could move through and where ports were, but there was nothing happening in the land space. So in the taiga, the detective is connecting these images of the maps to her own worldview. Before she entered the taiga, she knew herself and she understood the world in granular detail, or so she thought. But once she's within that landscape, the portolan charts don't have any use. She has no way of navigating this space. So she listens to her translator relay questions about a missing couple to the inhabitants of this small town. And she stands in the doorway of her cabin, which is itself also a liminal space. And she's listening, and she says all of a sudden she just hears these sounds, right? The sounds of birds all around me, the sound of something passing by, sudden swaying branches, leaves. I peered into the forest, but whatever it had been had already left, only air in motion. So we see in this paragraph a beginning of the breakdown of any kind of sense of border between the detective and the taiga. And she becomes for a moment a part of the forest. The feeling of joining with landscape becomes even more apparent in her movement through the forest. So Tilly argues that the process of walking through a landscape, of climbing mountains or swimming across rivers, makes one feel and think differently about them. So we perceive them differently once we experience them. And they're never the same again because of this dynamic connection between kinesthetic and sensory experience. For the detective, when she's walking through the forest, she experiences sounds and sights of the taiga as internal. She says, and something that moves inside, silence or fear, a leaf falling. So the beauty of Rivera Garza's strange language here is that a leaf falling, like silence or fear, something that you feel, that leaf falling seems to happen within the detective as much as it happens within the forest. And this continues when the detective and her translator finally find the woman and the man that she ran away with. The detective attempts to reconcile the forest with her original understanding of it, and she's left with this kind of dizzying effect of seeing everything at once. She says, what is between imagining a forest and living in a forest? What brings people together for the writing of a forest with the lived experiences of the forest? I remember it perfectly. There were four people in front of the tent, surrounded by the trees of a forest just before a storm, as if through a telescope or a microscope, their bodies, their dry lips, her voice. So again, we see this global, this large scale panorama of the taiga, and then the local, the inter and intrapersonal that's happening here. We zoom in on that. And it's dizzying, right? So they all sit together outside the tent, and the detective never really asks any questions. She never really finds out why the woman left or what it means that she left. And instead, they just listen to the storm. She says, I had never heard thunder in a place so packed with trees. The booming of the sky made me tremble. The wing beats of birds with no names, they couldn't have names. The violently clashing branches, the heart of the forest suddenly seemed to beat rapidly. Breathlessly is an adverb with rhythm. We all look up to the sky and in unison look back to the things on earth. There was a translator, a detective, a couple of fugitives. Once upon a time there was. We kept looking at each other like that for a while, motionless, terrified, as if the world were turning and fearful that everything would turn upside down, that the heavens would abruptly vomit en masse. We had just begun to understand. So this effect of zooming in and out of the previous scene sets up this moment where these four people are sitting outside the tent and suddenly they're linked in a way that they can't yet grasp. So again, we're on the far edge, we're on the torso, we're at the world's end, and the narrator and the others are left at this kind of precipice of understanding. At the very beginning of the narrative, the client tells the detective that this case is really a story about being in love. And she suggests that perhaps it's actually about being out of love. She corrects him, or being out of love. The translation in this section is really interesting because the word that Rivera Garza uses in Spanish, in the Spanish version, is where I take my title from, de desamor, or heartbreak. And again, toward the end of the narrative, the detective asks, is this the end of falling out of love? Or así que ese es el fin del desamor. Is this the end of heartbreak? So beyond the connotations of sexual or romantic relationships, there seems to be something about the experience of intimacy and the experience of liminal space that's linked here. I'm really interested in this question of translation about the heart, because Rivera Garza's work on the visceralist state. So I said I would talk a little bit more about that translation there. In the Spanish version of Grieving, she originally describes the relationship between the state and the body as el cuerpo entrañable. So in the Spanish version, we have this phrase, and it translates to something like close to the heart. But it loses a kind of implicit connotation or a connotation of endearment or of intimacy that's really about implicitly understanding that might maybe transcend distance or any attempt to separate. So the first attempt at translation, when they were working on Grieving, the translator proposed heartless state. But Rivera Garza rejected it. She said it was corny, but also I think she rejected it perhaps for a reason that we might see in the taiga, right? So she wanted something that was more local, more personal, more imminently tied to the body. And so the narrative is about something bigger than the client and his runaway wife. It's about what it means to understand a world that's fundamentally about being able to understand the world in a fundamentally different way through the body, and to see the world's end and to understand it as a state of being that we're always already in. It's always already implicit, and to experience that through movement, I think that's important. So perhaps the syndrome or the evil or the madness of the taiga, which the detective ends up bringing back with her to her real life, to her real space, perhaps that's an acceptance of this liminal space, or this ability to be both inside and outside the world system and to resist it. Rivera Garza writes in Grieving that the state and the cartels and a neoliberal regime that use the most vulnerable as cannon fodder in exchange for maximum profit. I think perhaps it's a way of understanding that, and understanding that you live in it and resisting it, understanding what it does to the body. So I think that these texts present perhaps from very different genres. We have poetry, we have essays, we have fiction. I think they're presenting a way of understanding the neoliberal forms that affect the body and movement, and the possibility of resistance through embodiment and through community. Rivera Garza's most recently translated essays, excitingly, they pick this up in her book, The Restless Dead, Necro-Writing and Disappropriation. So she picks this up, suggesting that communality and collaborative labor are aesthetic and ethical decolonial acts. So I think I'll stop there so we can have some conversation about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dominique. That was a wonderful presentation. I echo the applause from so many audience members. And I'll invite questions. Like I said, please feel free to raise your hand or to submit a question via the chat. If I miss it and don't call on you, don't be shy, just speak up. And I'm sure all of our colleagues here from English and literature are going to ask much more insightful questions than I will as a lawyer. But perhaps I'll take the moderator privilege of getting the ball rolling. The concept of visceral estate, it just resonates so well. I mean, I think it's one of those things that you don't articulate, and then when it's articulated, you immediately get it. And of course, grieving, the book Grieving focuses primarily on this collection of essays around violence, war on drugs. She, of course, starts the collection with sharing her personal story of her sister, who was a victim of femicide. And then as it progresses, I mean, I think the English translation only came out a month or two ago. So there's moments when they hint at the pandemic. And of course, one of the final chapters is about the state of Houston. The situation of Houston under the pandemic. And it kept on reflecting to me. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to think on this, Dominique, or if Rivera Garza has commented on works about the pandemic, really in Mexico, seeing the government's response here, as well as in multiple cases in the US, is another example of this visceralness, if I want to make that word a little more complicated to pronounce, of government just disregarding and not caring about, literally, again, the body of its citizenry. Thoughts, comments?
Yeah, so I'm from Texas, so your comment about Houston being a state is hilarious. I think Houston would like to think of itself as its own state. Arno says yes, he's also from Texas. So yeah, I think that part at the end was so moving for me, and it was added after the essays were collected and published in Spanish. Then she added it to the translation, and I think that what was most poignant for me in her reflection on the pandemic is this idea that the worst thing that could happen, she quotes Arundhati Roy, and she says that the worst thing that could happen is a return to normalcy after the pandemic, like this oppressive normalcy of a disregard for the human body and for the relationship between the body and the state. But I think that's what we're seeing. I think we're seeing a further alienation of that. We're seeing these neoliberal forms taking place or taking the form of personal responsibility, of an emphasis on looking out only for the individual and saying, well, I don't feel symptoms. I don't feel like I'm in danger. I feel like I'm fine. I don't believe this is real. And so then the individual is kind of taking the position of the state as well. So reifying those state beliefs and doctrines that push the body to the furthest limit that it can go. So I think we see that a lot in the poem I was talking about. We see this like alienation of the body or alienation of others. But I think she gives us something to hook into that gives us maybe, if not hope, at least a little bit of a turn at the end to think about how we can see the world differently, how we can possibly experience it differently.
Thank you. Others who want to share their thoughts or ask questions?
I think Cyrena, maybe.
Cyrena, please.
There. I had my hands up. Oh, Dominique, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. There's so many aspects to it that resonate with me. As always, as you know, I'm a big admirer of your work. So the question I have is, what happens actually to the body out there in the liminal space beyond how it repositions itself there. And what I mean by that is you talk about capitalism and sort of bring it up as sort of like a shadowy presence around NAFTA, around all these things, and around this issue of normalcy. But I don't know that there's a real sort of analysis or exploration or investigation of and into what that relationship can be in the beyond, in that space that is suggested by the space in which the body moves in resistance. Am I making any sense?
Yes, yes, definitely. I think in the novella, there's actually a whole part that I didn't touch on toward the end about sex work and about sexual relationships and what gets produced out of the body in those relationships, what's excreted and what's produced in the coming together of people within this space. And it's all super strange. As I don't even know if I can describe it. There's like something about like small anatomically correct dolls that are having sex. It's very strange. I mean, super, super weird. But I think what's important there is her emphasis on the secretions of the body and what's happening when these bodies are in pain or in ecstasy, and how they are producing different effects or different affects even in people. So the couple that she's looking for, there's a scene where they have sex and there's somebody watching them, and after, like in the middle of them having sex, they become sick and they start excreting these pieces of bodies, right? So again, we have like almost a turned image of reproduction. We have these pieces of bodies being expelled. So I'm wondering if perhaps in expelling those pieces of the body, perhaps it's a rejection of the maybe of reproduction, like reproductive futurity, but also of capitalist reproduction. I don't know if that really answers your question. It's something I've been thinking about.
It does answer it in a really unexpected and interesting way. But I wonder if there cannot be a return to normalcy. And I understand that, what that means. But if there's not a return to normalcy, then there's not a return. There's something new. So what might that something new be that she's reaching toward? And I say this in the context of the fact that now, given everything that's going on, well, there are lots of people who are reimagining capitalism, and they're reimagining it or suggesting or pushing toward a reimagination of capitalism because of these very harmful systems that it camouflages. So I'm just wondering if you have ideas about what she might be reaching toward. And I really like what you were just saying about the excretion of pieces of bodies, because that tells me that already the capitalist system or structure fragmented those bodies. And I think that is completely true.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if there are any ideas about what it reaches toward, since there cannot be a return.
Right. Yeah, I think she's really focused on this idea of becoming. So we're kind of like always are on the edge, and I think she does that as a resistance to describing a future. But also, I think in her newest collection of essays that was most recently translated, she's talking a lot about communality and about what it means to be in collaboration and in communion with others. And she looks toward Indigenous communities to think about how that works. So I think there may be some answer there. I'm not sure if there can be a new kind of capitalism, because I truly do believe that capitalism is predicated upon racism and upon settler colonialism in a way that can't be restructured. I don't know if it can be saved. So yeah, that excretion of the body parts and a rejection of that futurity may be that kind of answer.
I think Arnaud had a question as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Dominic. Those incredible texts, and they sound extremely complicated. You were an expert guide into, not only I'm like Mike, I'd never heard of this author, and they sound like challenging texts. And so my question kind of follows up on Serena's in a lot of ways, just because, kind of in the same way that I remember experiencing Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands as an undergraduate student, and actually being off put by some of the just kind of intentional strangeness of the prose or of the imagery. And I was wondering if you think, is there kind of continuation from Anzaldua into Garza's work, and then do you see that strangeness that you spoke to so eloquently as effective for a vision? Now, obviously, Garza seems to be saying that she's not a detective; she's not here to solve the riddles, like she says. But is there still? Do you yourself wish for maybe more concrete answers? Sometimes when you're reading her works, are you okay with that kind of negative capability that she seems to be enjoining so many of us to welcome? Is that maybe the effective revolutionary dimension of it, or do you sometimes wish for something more concrete or a more specific vision? Like maybe, recently NAFTA was revised and turned into the USMCA. Do you hope that maybe there'll be a next novel that actually addresses maybe 2017 onwards, as opposed to starting with kind of 1992?
Yeah, so I think there's absolutely a lineage there. There's a connection to Anzaldua. I think a lot of the strangeness comes from both from her writing, but also from the translation process, both that happens starting with her writing. So thinking in English, being in an English speaking country, writing in Spanish, and then having it translated back into English or into other languages. I think that gives it some of the strangeness. I think it's purposefully estranging. I think it is meant to point out the strangeness of the moment in which we live. I don't know if there will be something that's like after NAFTA. I mean, I think the USMCA kind of just further solidifies these neoliberal forms. I'm not sure that there's going to be a huge difference in literary production affected by NAFTA versus literary production affected by the USMCA.
I mean, we were all hoping, maybe some of us hoping against hope, that the USMCA would be an opportunity to redress all of NAFTA's problems, like environmental, degradation and agronomic kind of exploitation on a major scale. And instead, it's just turned into like more border protection and more, digital surveillance and so forth. So it's possible she'll take the paranoid kind of surveillance angle as a theme for the next part. But super great stuff, Dominique. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Kate?
Well, thanks, Dominique. This was terrific. I've been looking forward to it ever since I learned that you've been working on her. I think you're such a wonderful person to take on this writer. And this was a really, really superb tour through the interconnections between so many of her works. And it's a real treat to have you take us into the most recently translated work as well. I wanted to ask you another follow-up on the question of translation that you've introduced to us so well, and ask you to think a little bit more about translation as a collaborative practice. So the role of the translator in the Taiga syndrome is so profound and also becomes very strange by the end. And you know, there is an interesting phenomenon in thinking about reading Garza in these different contexts that she's so deliberate about. And I'm thinking also of the way in which she works as a translator herself and has also worked as a translator in, you know, in collaborative forms. And so she's worked as a, you know, as a team of translators, for example, translating Fred Moten. She has several different experiences. And so the way in which translation as collaboration came up in your talk, but I wanted, given that you have so many, you know, really remarkable ways about thinking about both collaboration and then the political formation of coalition, I was wondering if I could just invite you to think a little bit more about the role of translation and the role of this translated novella in the North American context, as well as in the context that you've brought it out from.
Yeah. So I should say that I'm a heritage speaker of Tex-Mex. So I grew up speaking like Tejano Spanish, slang Spanish, and really learned the language in school. For various reasons that have to do with living in the U.S. as a Latino in the particular time in which I grew up, and which my grandparents and parents grew up. So when I'm looking at this, it's also a translation process for me in reading and in thinking about the original writing and thinking about how it comes through in the translation. And it's been really fantastic to understand her process as somebody who is always seems to be thinking in translation and thinking in translating her ideas and translating her thoughts, and then also working as a translator and then working with translators on her work. It seems like the whole creative process here is about pushing this through so many filters, right? Or so many different phases of understanding and different modes of thinking, and different people and different subjectivities, so that we end up with this being a kind of collaborative process anyway. And I think that's really interesting, and it speaks to her emphasis that in the newest translation that we see this emphasis on collaboration and communality. So to translate, I think for Rivera Garza is this continual mode of being, right? Which I think speaks back to those neoliberal forms, right? So we're all connected in this political and economic reality that we exist in. And to move through that space is to constantly be translating, whether it's language, whether it's experience, whether it's relationships or subjectivity, we're constantly translating there. What's really cool about the translator and the Taiga syndrome, which you were hinting at, Kate, is that this, when they first meet, he tries to talk to her in her language. She can't understand him. So then they agree to speak a third language, which is neither her language nor his language, so that they can communicate. And then he translates with the people who they encounter in the village in the taiga. So there's like 4 different languages going on here. They're constantly circulating and trying to make sense of what's happening, in the same way that she's trying to find this woman, and she's trying to understand the taiga and what it is and what it means. And then that moment where they're all sitting in front of the tent, and she says, the translator, the detective, and 2 fugitives, you don't know who's who in that particular configuration. And I think that's what's interesting about it, is that it can be any one of them in any particular moment that they happen to be in. So again, they're translating also subjectivities and sharing in those subjectivities.
Wonderful. I see we're already 10 minutes past noon here in Mexico City, so 1:10 in South Bend. This has really just been such an engaging and interesting presentation and talk. I'll give one last call if there's any last minute questions. But otherwise, please everyone join me in thanking Dominique for this opportunity, and thanking all of you for joining us as well. I hope you all have a safe and happy holidays, and enjoy the rest of your days or day.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity.
Take care, everyone.